What if I told you that many of the rights you hold dear today, the right to a fair trial, the idea that no one, not even our leaders, is above the law, all began with a single document, sealed in a muddy field over 800 years ago? This isn't just a piece of parchment, it's a promise, a shield. And it was brought into existence not by a benevolent king or a revolutionary mob, but by one man who has been largely forgotten by history. A man who stood between a tyrant and a civil war, armed with nothing but an idea. This is the story of the Magna Carta and its true, unsung guardian. To understand the Charter, you first have to understand the man who made it necessary, King John of England. History has not been kind to John, and for good reason. He was a king who seemed to specialize in failure and cruelty. He lost his crown jewels in a river. He lost his family's vast lands in France, earning the nickname John Softsword. But his greatest failures were reserved for his own people. John saw England not as a kingdom to be nurtured, but as a personal treasure chest to be plundered. He levied impossibly high taxes on his barons, not to fund the state, but to finance disastrous wars and his own lavish lifestyle. He sold off official positions, twisted the law to his advantage, and imprisoned his rivals without trial. Justice was not a right, it was a commodity to be bought and sold. Stories from the time tell of him starving his opponents to death, of his paranoia and his rage. He was a king who ruled by fear, and by 1215, that fear was beginning to curdle into rebellion. The barons of England, the powerful landowners who were meant to be the pillars of the throne, were at their breaking point. They were sharpening their swords and preparing for war. England was a powder keg, and the king himself was holding the match. The kingdom was about to tear itself apart. But into this storm of tyranny and rebellion stepped an unlikely figure. Not a warrior or a politician, but a scholar. His name was Stephen Langton, the Archbishop of Canterbury. Langton was a man of principle, one of Europe's most respected theologians, but he was caught in an impossible position. He was appointed by the Pope, which infuriated King John, who had wanted his own man in the role. For years, John had exiled him from England. When Langton finally returned, he found a nation on the brink. He knew a civil war would destroy the kingdom, regardless of who won. He believed there had to be a third option, a path away from the brute force of the king and the brute force of the barons. He didn't want a new king. He wanted a new kind of kingdom, one where the king's power had limits, defined and guaranteed by the law. It was a revolutionary idea, and to make it a reality, Langton reached back into the past. He unearthed a forgotten document, the Coronation Charter of Henry I, a previous king who had promised to end the abuses of his predecessor. It was old, and it had been largely ignored, but to Langton, it was a blueprint, a precedent. It proved that an English king had, before, agreed to limit his own power. Armed with this old charter, Stephen Langton began the most delicate and dangerous work of his life. He presented the idea not just to the furious barons, but to the moderate ones, winning them over not with calls to battle, but with the logic of law. He argued that their grievances were not just complaints, they were legal rights. He helped them channel their rage into a list of specific demands, a written charter of liberties that would bind the king. This was his genius. He transformed a messy, violent rebellion into a political negotiation. He was the intellectual architect of the movement, turning a feudal squabble over taxes into a profound debate about justice, freedom, and the rule of law. He was shaping the very soul of the rebellion. The road to peace was treacherous. King John was furious, seeing the charter as a direct assault on his God-given authority. At one point he sneered, "Why do not the barons, with these unjust exactions, ask for my kingdom?" The most radical barons still wanted war. Langton was the central mediator, the calm voice in the whirlwind, shuttling between the two camps, tirelessly working to find common ground, and reminding them that the alternative was the destruction of England itself. Finally, in the early summer of 1215, the crisis came to a head. The barons renounced their feudal ties to John and marched on London, capturing the city. The king had been outmaneuvered. With his capital in the hands of his enemies and his authority collapsing, John was forced to the negotiating table. The place they chose to meet was a water meadow on the banks of the River Thames, a neutral ground between the king's castle at Windsor and the rebel camp at Staines. Its name has echoed through history, Runnymede. Imagine the scene. June 15th, 1215. On one side, the royal tent of King John, fuming, humiliated, but cornered. On the other, the powerful, armored barons, tasting victory. And in the middle, Stephen Langton, holding the document that he had poured his soul into. For days, they argued over every clause, every word. And within that document were the seeds of a new world. It stated that the church would be free. It standardized weights and measures. But then came the revolutionary heart of the charter, clauses that we still echo in our courts today. Clause 39. No free man shall be seized or imprisoned or stripped of his rights or possessions, except by the lawful judgment of his equals or by the law of the land. And Clause 40. To no one will we sell, to no one deny or delay right or justice. This was the masterstroke. For the first time, the king himself was being placed beneath the law. It was a radical redistribution of power. John, seeing no other way to save his crown, finally gave his assent. He did not sign the Magna Carta. Kings of that era didn't sign documents. He affixed his royal seal in wax. The Great Charter was born. But the story doesn't end there. In fact, the Magna Carta was, at first, a spectacular failure. It held together for less than 3 months. King John had only sealed it under duress. He secretly wrote to the Pope, the very man who had appointed Langton, and Pope Innocent III declared the Magna Carta null and void, calling it illegal, unjust, harmful to royal rights, and shameful to the English people. Freed from his promise, John gathered an army of mercenaries and plunged England into a brutal civil war, the First Barons' War. The peace that Stephen Langton had worked so hard to build had shattered. The great shield for the people's liberty was broken. It seemed that the tyrant had won. And this is where we find Stephen Langton's true guardianship. He was suspended by the Pope for his role in creating the Charter. His career was in ruins, but he never gave up on the idea of it. During the war, he and his allies protected the principles of the Charter, keeping them alive. Then, a year later, fate intervened. King John, campaigning in the east of England, contracted dysentery and died. His son, Henry III, was only 9 years old. The regents who ruled for the boy king needed to unite the fractured country. And to do that, they needed to bring the rebellious barons back into the fold. So, they did something remarkable. They voluntarily reissued the Magna Carta. It was this act and subsequent reissues that cemented the Magna Carta not as a failed peace treaty, but as the foundational document of English law. It was no longer a rebel's demand, but a king's promise freely given. The idea, guarded by Langton and his allies through the darkness of war, had survived its flawed birth and had been reborn, stronger than ever. That idea spread across the world. Centuries later, it would inspire America's founding fathers as they drafted the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. It shaped legal systems in Canada, Australia, India, and dozens of other nations. The words hammered out in that muddy field at Runnymede became the bedrock of freedom for billions. So when we think of the great protectors of liberty, we should remember the barons with their swords and the founding fathers with their quill pens. But we should also remember the quiet scholar, the forgotten guardian, Stephen Langton, the man who, caught between a tyrant and a war, dared to believe that a better world could be written into law. He didn't just broker a deal, he encoded justice into the DNA of our civilization. And that was his true, enduring victory.